Hey guys, let's discuss about other 10 underrated RPGs. In case you missed the first video, you can find the link in the description. As for this one, I wanna talk about some old school RPGs and then focus on newer releases. Without further ado, let's begin with Golvellius, released in 1988 for the MSX, Sega Master System and iOS. This is an action RPG released by Compile. The story is relatively simple. Golvellius sent his forces to attack the kingdom of Alade, and in the process prevent their people to reach the valley where they get water. In face of these events, the king falls ill. In this situation, her daughter tried to go to the valley to look for medicinal herbs, but in the process got kidnapped. That's when Kelesis, a wandering hero, hears about these events and decides to jump into the fray. While the game was well received, I rarely hear anyone talk about it. For the gameplay, do not overcomplicate it. It is pretty much an old school Zelda game, but with enough mechanics to make a distinction. Nonetheless, it's worth saying that back in the day it was rough around some edges, because it has some platforming which is not the best, to be honest. This game gets better after you reach the overworld. It is definitely a solid game, but it takes a bit of time to truly appreciate it. As for the version I recommend the most, look for the American one. Compared with the Japanese and European, the American version has a slightly better soundtrack. In the second place, Terranigma, released in 1995 for the SNES. This is the third entry of what was known as Heaven and Earth Saga, including Illusion of Gaia and Soul Blazer. Some people may add Actraiser. The thing here is that they are spiritual successors, so you will find within their narrative things that link one another in cool ways. This is a game that has an extraordinary story for what was conceived back in the day. While on the surface a bit of a classic, it has a deep narrative between lines. Now this story presents an ancient conflict between a god and the devil, where on one side things flourish, and on the other it was pretty much a wasteland. There was a fierce fight between these two sides, which eventually led the surface to be submerged and the underworld to be sealed. As for the main character of this story, Ark will be the first human to leave Krista and explore the underworld. It is another game that was well received back in the day, but as time passed, kinda forgotten, and slightly underrated. However, sometimes is rated a bit high, so this one may be debatable. It is an action RPG with most of its gameplay showing this top-down view, and a few side-scrolling parts and Mode 7. Whereas you beat enemies, you will increase levels. It is relatively simple, where depending from different inputs, you will release different attacks. There are also magic attacks that can be obtained by gathering magic rocks, used to buy items that give you some spells, and after using these spells, you get back the same number of magic rocks. Not the greatest execution, but they have their uses. I would also say similar as some other old school games. And as you advance, you will get different skills like swimming, climbing, and so on. Definitely worth the time, and recommended. Just beware that its beginning can be a bit annoying. In the third entry we find Castlevania Curse of Darkness, released in 2005 for the PS2 and Xbox. This story follows the after events from Castlevania 3, where Dracula cursed Europe after being beaten, spreading a disease where people get violent. Our main character in this tale is Hector, Devil Forge master who originally worked for Dracula and also fought against Trevor. Nonetheless, Hector was disgusted with Dracula's methods, leaving Castlevania behind. However, that was only the beginning, because an old friend will accuse Hector's fiancée of witchcraft. Needless to say what happened. Seeking revenge, Hector decides to come back to Castlevania. In all honesty, I don't understand why 3D Castlevania games are usually underrated and then compared with God of War. Anyway, for the gameplay, it is presented in a 3D world, where Hector has the chance to use different weapons, like knuckles, swords, axes, spears, and so on. Each weapon has different kind of combos that you can link in relatively easy ways, and it follows after the steps of Symphony of the Night, with similar things here and there. What makes this game interesting was the chance to train different familiars, or innocent devils, which evolve depending of the main weapon that you are using, and ultimately add extra stats to Hector, depending from their affinity. Also, as they level up, they can give you eggs, so you can train multiple familiars, or depending from their evolutions, they can open different areas to explore, support in combat, and so on. Another game that I definitely recommend. In the fourth entry we find Yggdra Union, released in 2006. It can be found on the GBA, PSP, iOS, Android, Switch, and Steam. The main character of this game is Yggdra, Fantasy's princess, following the after events from Blaze Union, where Yggdra escaped from the Empire, where she is being chased. However, in the process, the Empire ends up attacking Milanor's base by accident, beginning the events of this game, where Yggdra will try to unify the entire world under her sovereignty. Just keep in mind that in the PSP entry some events were added, events that help to link some stories in the series. This is another underrated game that had mixed receptions because it was stupidly hard, later toned down for multiple people to enjoy. This game combines cards and strategy elements similar to Blaze Union and Yggdra Union, which makes them different from the classic strategic RPG, where once we start a battle, you'll have the chance to choose different characters and equip items that last for a finite number of stages, or heal your HP, AK, morale, or depending from the character and the cards multiple things play around like gender, technique, attack, luck, and so on, where it is important to balance the passive and aggressiveness of your units while in combat. But this is just scratching the surface because it is quite technical for your standard strategic RPG, so be prepared to see tutorial windows a good chunk of time. If you wanna play the game in all its glory, look for the GBA version, where you will have to mind really well each step. It can be looked as unforgiving, but it balances things in cool ways, with something similar as risk versus reward. For the next spot, Advance Wars: Days of Ruin, released in 2008. You can find it on the DS and 3DS. The story presented here is something that can be found on different games, movies, and so on, so it is not that original. Here 90% of the humanity has already perished, where the constant meteor strikes have pretty much obliterated everything. As consequence, a big cloud of dust rose up in the sky, preventing processes such as photosynthesis, so this is another survival of the fittest. And here we will follow Will's steps, survivor who escaped from an academy in ruins. In the process, a sergeant confronts Will with a group of riders. For his fortune, Rubinel's 12th Battalion saves our MC, who subsequently joins the cause to save as many survivors as possible. The thing with this story is that it can be predictable in some moments, also having some mixed reviews, but for the most part it did well. Personally, I consider it slightly underrated. A bit questionable if you say that this is an RPG, but a strategic game, definitely. Compared with the previous Advance Wars, here things as the COs or the special effects do not have as much impact as before, so this game falls into a much more conventional strategic game, which adds and readjusts several units, where they rank up as they fight and win confrontations. What I really like about this game is the huge number of units that you will eventually use as you advance in the story, where the strategic elements start to become much more important because of different engagements and terrain effects. I definitely recommend this strategic game. In the sixth spot, Radiant Historia, released in 2010. You can find it on the DS and 3DS. Here we will follow Stock from Alistel, sent by his superior Heis to escort a spy back to the capital. Prior to be sent into this mission, he is given the White Chronicle, and moments later united with Rainey and Marco. As they proceed in this mission, they get ambushed by Granorg troops, the antagonist of this story, where Stock, wounded, somehow escapes, but also in the process gets into Historia, a realm without time, where Theo and Liptip explain him about some of the effects of the desertification and other important things for the plot. However, Historia has other uses, which is being able to travel in time, so it is up to Stock to set things in the right way. Not as underrated when it first appeared back in 2010, but still slightly underrated. As for the gameplay, depending from our actions we will be able to proceed in this story, where sometimes we need to reach certain events, to then come to the past and open different routes. The part of taking choices here and there can be a bit gimmicky, but definitely worth the time as they have some clever puzzles here and there. As for the fights, it has a really unique system, where you need to link attacks by pulling, pushing, moving and stuff like that. While at the beginning simple, as you advance, this is a dynamic that will have to be improved, as there are enemies that otherwise take a lot of time and energy to beat, increasing your chances to be beaten in the process. However, don't worry, I will say that the game is pretty much balanced, just a couple of enemies will really push you to abuse this system. As for the version I recommend, go for the 3DS one, because they added some extra pieces to the story that pretty much closes some untouched events from the original game. In the 7th spot, we find Fairy Fencer F, released in 2013. You can play it on PS3, PS4, Steam and Switch. This story begins explaining that at the beginning of time there were two gods fighting each other in an indirect way, by creating tons of weapons for others to use in combat. Eventually these gods were sealed. Fast forward many years in the future, our main character Fang appears, where he takes one of these furies out of the ground, releasing Irene out of her slumber, and after some dumb events, getting into jail for stealing food and get paralyzed after drinking tea, he meets Tiara, character that will eventually talk about the Battle of Ancient Times, pushing Fang to gather furies to use them in the revival ritual, where depending from your actions there are different endings. To me this is a really underrated game, while not the best, definitely worth playing, where you will have to traverse different stages to find the different furies, gather allies and fight some unforgiving battles in control areas, where depending from your attacks you can hit multiple enemies or really specific places, where boss battles can be punishing as heck if you try to brute force your way. If there is something tiring about this game is that it can be repetitive in some ends, I am not going to deny that, but it offers entertaining gameplay, where each character has a defined role in the team, and the story changes depending from your actions. Each side of the story pushes you to play with different characters that also need other furies to patch or increase stats and skills. Kinda basic in some ways, and stupid technical in others. Also beware about the true ending, it can be nerve-wracking. In the 8th place, Stranger of Sword City, released in 2014. You can play it on 360, Steam, Vita, Xbox One and Switch. Personally, I recommend the revisited edition that has Saviors of Sapphire Wings and this game. That way you will follow the after events from Saviors of Sapphire Wings, where in a kind of isekai way the MC of this story arrives into this place in a plane. And as the MC is shown the rough way to Sword City, finds that there are other people that have landed here in the same fashion way. For the fortune or unfortune of this MC, choices will have to be taken, pushing the balance to the dark or light side. Not to be confused with good or bad. This story is kinda convoluted with many important messages between lines, that may not make that much sense at first, but I have already explained some of the confusing events in another video, in case you are interested. This is another really underrated game. The thing here is that we are talking about old school mechanics that if not taken into consideration since the beginning, you will have a lot of issues later on, and probably having to retrain every character for the post-content. So take your time to understand each class, because you will have to train your characters thinking into specialized roles, as you can reclass characters pretty much whenever you want, and it is within that mechanic that you will want to get the best skills for each character. This game is far from the most annoying levels found on first-person dungeon crawlers, but definitely challenging, where you will have to face several random encounters that may beat the heck out of you real good. But once you pull a competitive team, with a clear path in mind, some slight farming sessions here and there, everything is going to flow really well. Otherwise, you will have to patch levels and equipment every now and then, turning this game into a grind fest. In the next spot we find Moero Crystal, released in 2015, for the Vita and Switch. This game presents a really dumb story where a particular piece of clothing gets robbed, which is quite important as they were created by pretty much God, unbalancing things in the process and raising Earth into a vortex in the sky. Be prepared to see a lot of those jokes, so this is not going to be a game for everyone, so beware about the rating. Definitely underrated and way better than Moero Chronicle, as this game dives much more into different kind of events, which in all honesty is the main dish. Really entertaining if you wanna kill some time. This is a first-person dungeon crawler where you can assemble different team compositions as you advance, and every monster girl is pretty much a boss fight. That might push a little bit your strategy, particularly the purple ones. Just beware about the post-content where they can beat the heck out of you in unfair ways. So you may have to find some items and increase a couple of levels. In my case, I never farm, even while playing in hard difficulty, but you will require a good strategy. And in the 10th entry, Labyrinth of Refrain, released in 2016. You can play it on Vita, PS4, Steam and Switch. In this story we're going to follow Dronia and Luca, two witches who visit Refrain to dive into a cursed labyrinth where human beings cannot survive. This is where the Tractarus the Monstrum or the player will dive into the labyrinth with a brigade of puppets, where they find the multiple chambers that link other worlds. And as this story unfolds, we will get to know that Dronia is looking for 3 particular keys to open the gate to the realm of the dead. As the player reaches the truth about Refrain, things start to escalate, more and more. This is another terribly underrated game. On one side I get it, it is a story that takes a freaking lot of time to develop, like 90-100 hours to finish the main game plus 20 to 30 hours to wrap the post-content, where the first part can be seen as not really interesting. It has touchy subjects here and there, I am not gonna lie, even questionable at times, so just consider the rating. It is another first-person dungeon crawler with mechanics that require some time to fully understand. But summarizing them, as you advance, you need to get as lucky as possible to find the right brigades, where you can allocate different puppets, train the right kind of puppet by transferring souls, so you can specialize for specific roles, like critical/war hits, magic, support, defense, and stuff like that. It is important to do this in the right order because as you transfer souls, you will have the chance to transfer skills, but every character has a finite number of slots, so ideally you want each role to be as perfect as possible, otherwise you will have to patch a bit with some extra levels and then equipment. So yeah, it is a story that takes some time, and gameplay that requires a good strategy. In the first 70 hours or so, you can mess up in a lot of ways. But from that point onwards, if you wanna finish the game and the post-content, what I explained needs to be addressed. I definitely recommend it. It offers some amazing things down the line. And that is all, folks. I hope you found this video informative. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.